During the winter of 1887, a team of workers repairing the base of a deserted Catholic orphanage in the Pennsylvania countryside uncovered something that would torment them forever. Under the floor of the former dining area, they discovered 93 small crosses made of wood, each one etched with a child's name and a date ranging from 1834 to 1851. What made this find so unsettling was not merely the quantity of crosses, but the reality that church documents showed the Santa Eulalia Orphanage had been home to precisely 93 children throughout its 17 years of operation. The crew promptly notified the local police. However, before any official inquiry could start, officials from the Diocese of Philadelphia showed up and seized everything, declaring it confidential church material. All construction work was stopped. The structure was torn down within a week, and the men were given large amounts of money to sign contracts swearing them to secrecy about their discovery. For more than 100 years, the real story of Santa Eulalia Orphanage has been concealed. However, newly found letters and accounts expose a narrative so horrifying that it questions our entire understanding of 19th century American religious charity. Before we go further into the tale of Santa Eulalia Orphanage, be warned, this channel isn't for everybody. It is only for the most courageous individuals who are willing to reveal the most terrible secrets buried within America's religious past. Not many platforms dare to share the kinds of stories we share here. Narratives that expose the darkness lurking behind holy walls. If you possess the fortitude to learn the truth regarding those 93 children, click subscribe and turn on notifications. Then let us know in the comments which state you're in. Do you have the strength to confront the atrocities that religious organizations have attempted to hide for decades? The truth of Santa Eulalia starts in the tiny community of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where the devout thought they were supporting God's work, but were in fact financing something much more evil. In the 1830s, Millbrook, Pennsylvania, was a hamlet of just 300 people, situated in the gentle hills of Lancaster County, where German immigrants had made their home generations earlier. The town was mostly Lutheran and Reformed, with a tiny yet increasing Catholic community that had come with the Irish railroad workers who remained after the Pennsylvania Railroad was completed in 1832. It was a tight-knit place where everybody knew each other, where the sound of church bells defined the pace of everyday life, and where the image of orphaned children begging on the corners had become a distressing symbol of the industrial era's cruel truths. The Catholic community, under the leadership of Father Heinrich Kellerman, a severe Bavarian priest with intense blue eyes and a known reputation for strictness, had found it difficult to build their place in this Protestant-dominated area. Father Kellerman came to Millbrook in 1833 with grand designs to construct not only a church but a whole campus to serve the spiritual and communal needs of his expanding congregation. He was a highly educated man, having studied theology in Munich before coming to America, and he had a magnetic talent for eliciting devotion and fear in equal parts. Father Kellerman conceived the idea for Santa Eulalia Orphanage during an especially severe winter, when he saw numerous homeless children freezing in the town square. He recognized a chance not only to serve God, but to display Catholic charity to the doubting Protestant community. In just a few months, he had collected sufficient funds from affluent Catholic donors in Philadelphia to buy a big Victorian mansion on the edge of town, a commanding 3-story building with high windows and a surrounding porch that had been owned by an unsuccessful textile merchant. The locals observed with interest as Father Kellerman converted the mansion into what he named a symbol of Catholic mercy. He employed expert artisans to add a chapel in the east wing, change the large parlors into sleeping quarters, and construct a separate kitchen and dining area. The most notable new feature was a high bell tower that ascended from the building's center, its bronze bell forged in Germany and engraved with the words Laudate Dominum, meaning praise the Lord. Sister Margaret Clare, an Irish nun from the Sisters of Mercy, came in the spring of 1834 to act as the orphanage's supervisor. She was a woman around 40 years old, with early gray hair and hands marked by the roughness of labor. Those who encountered her said she had gentle eyes, but a smile that seldom appeared, and she spoke with the confidence of a person who had dedicated her life to looking after neglected children. She was accompanied by 2 younger nuns, Sister Bernadette and Sister Catherine, both in their 20s and enthusiastic to serve in what they thought would be a righteous endeavor. The orphanage first opened on June 15, 1834, with an event that drew almost the whole town. Protestant and Catholic families both came to see what the regional paper described as a brilliant model of Christian charity. Father Kellerman gave an intense sermon about the holy responsibility to care for the most vulnerable. Sister Margaret Clare stood quietly next to him, her hands clasped in prayer, her expression a picture of calm resolve. The initial children came within days. There were siblings who had lost their parents in a factory incident, a little girl left behind by a traveling entertainer, boys who had been surviving as thieves on the streets of Philadelphia. The Catholic community supported the endeavor with remarkable excitement, arranging fundraisers, giving clothes and food, and offering their time to assist with everyday tasks. Even some Protestant families, touched by the clear need, donated to the effort. Yet from the start, there were murmurs about the severe discipline upheld inside the orphanage's walls. The children were seldom spotted playing outside, and when they were visible, they moved with the stiff accuracy of soldiers instead of the natural energy of the young. The bell tower's bronze bell chimed, not only for prayers, but at all hours. Its deep ringing so persistent that the townsfolk started to grumble about the noise, interrupting their rest. Local suppliers, who brought goods to the orphanage, mentioned that the children they briefly saw appeared unusually silent and pale, always watched by one of the nuns, who observed their every action with fierce concentration. When residents asked about visiting or seeing the facilities, Father Kellerman courteously but firmly stated that the children needed a controlled setting free from external disruptions to correctly form their moral character. The orphanage's standing in the town stayed favorable during its first year, but there were small indications that something was wrong. Dr. Thomas Whitmore, Millbrook's sole doctor, wrote in his private diary that he had never been asked to care for any of the orphan children, even though he treated almost every other child in town for different illnesses. When he questioned Father Kellerman about this, the priest clarified that Sister Margaret Clare had considerable medical training and was completely able to manage any health problems that occurred. As winter came in 1834, the residents began to notice that the count of children at the orphanage appeared to change in ways that didn't align with known arrivals. Some people insisted they had noticed a specific child one week, only to never see that child again. When questioned, Sister Margaret Clare would simply state that children arrive and depart as God desires, and that many had been fortunate to be placed with caring families far away. The reality of what was occurring behind the walls of Santa Eulalia Orphanage wouldn't start to surface for another 10 years, but the roots of terror were already being sown in those initial months of operation. The bronze bell kept ringing at all times. The children stayed pale and quiet, and Father Kellerman's sermons became more concentrated on ideas of sacrifice, obedience, and the cleansing nature of suffering. What the residents didn't know was that Father Kellerman had brought more than just religious education from his time in Bavaria. He had also adopted certain medieval Catholic customs that the Church had formally rejected long before. Practices he felt were needed to save not only the souls of the orphaned children but the souls of the whole community. In his private rooms, he kept thorough diaries written in Latin, recording what he named the sacred work of purification that he believed God had tasked him to do. The scene was prepared for 17 years of horror that would stay hidden until long after the final child had vanished from Santa Eulalia Orphanage. The first indication that something was seriously amiss occurred on a freezing January morning in 1835. when young Timothy Fletcher, the town's most dependable delivery boy, reached the orphanage with a wagon loaded with winter provisions. What he saw that day would trouble him forever, though he wouldn't speak of it until he was dying 60 years later. Timothy had been delivering to the orphanage for months, always told to leave the items at the service door and ring the bell. Once, Sister Bernadette would usually come out, sign for the delivery, and send him off with hardly a word. But on this morning, the severe cold had frozen the lock on the service door, and Timothy could hear what seemed like children sobbing from inside the building. Worried that the children might be in trouble, Timothy went to the front entrance, where he found the main door slightly open. The crying was clearer now, blended with what sounded like a woman's voice speaking in an unfamiliar language. Tracking the sound, he entered the hallway where the scent of burning candles mixed with something else, something clinical and disagreeable that turned his stomach. The crying was coming from the chapel, and as Timothy got closer, he could see through the partly open door what looked like a religious service. Sister Margaret Clare stood at the altar, facing away from the door, speaking quickly in Latin while holding what appeared to be a small bundle wrapped in white cloth around her. A group of children knelt in total silence, their heads bent so low their foreheads nearly touched the ground. What troubled Timothy most wasn't the ceremony itself, but the children's look. Even from behind, he could see their clothes were ripped and soiled. Their small bodies looked abnormally thin, and some seemed to be trembling, though he couldn't tell if from cold, fear, or sickness. The white bundle in Sister Margaret Clare's arms seemed to be shifting slightly, and Timothy realized with rising dread that whatever was wrapped inside was alive. Suddenly, Sister Bernadette's voice broke the chapel's quiet. "Who dares to interrupt the sacred work?" Timothy turned to find the young nun standing right behind him. Her face was contorted with an anger he had never seen in any religious figure. Her normally tidy habit was messy, and her hands were marked with something dark that didn't look like ink. I brought the supplies," Timothy stuttered, moving back toward the door. The service entrance was frozen, and I heard crying. "There is no crying here," Sister Bernadette stated, her voice now strangely calm. "Only prayer, only the holy work of purification." She stepped closer to Timothy, and he could smell something metallic on her breath. "You will leave now, and you will tell no one of this. The work we do here is sacred, but it is not for ordinary people to understand." Timothy nodded anxiously and moved toward the door, but Sister Bernadette's hand shot out and gripped his wrist with unexpected force. "Swear it," she whispered. "Swear on your mother's grave that you will never speak of what you believe you saw." "Here, I swear," Timothy gasped, and the nun let him go. He fled the orphanage without looking back, abandoning the wagon of supplies in the snow outside the front door. That night, Timothy's mother found him in their barn, sitting in the hay and staring blankly with wide, scared eyes. When she asked what was wrong, he only said that he never wanted to deliver to the orphanage again. She assumed he had been scared by the strict nuns and agreed to send his older brother instead. But Timothy's fear went much deeper than a fear of stern religious women. What he had seen in the chapel would replay in his mind for years: the unnatural quiet of the children, the way they knelt as if their lives depended on perfect stillness, and most disturbing of all, the way Sister Margaret Clare had held that white bundle as if it contained something both precious and awful. The next day, Father Kellerman visited the Fletcher family personally, something he had never done before. He spoke alone with Timothy for almost an hour, and when he left, the boy seemed even more upset than before. He started having nightmares that made him scream at night, and he developed a stutter that lasted for months. Mrs. Fletcher, a devoted Lutheran, tried to comfort her son by saying that Catholics had different ways of worship, but Timothy would only shake his head and whisper, "It wasn't worship, Mama. It was something else." When pushed to explain, he would go silent and refuse to say more. The delivery duty was taken over by Timothy's brother Marcus, but even he began to report strange events. He noticed that the number of children visible through the windows seemed to change weekly, and he insisted that he sometimes heard singing from the basement, even though Sister Margaret Clare claimed the building had no basement. Most disturbing of all, he started finding small objects scattered around the orphanage grounds: a child's shoe, a torn piece of fabric, a wooden toy shaped like a cross. When Marcus asked Sister Bernadette about these things, she would collect them quickly and say that children were careless with their things. But Marcus noticed that the items never seemed to match the clothes or belongings of the children he could see through the windows. Dr. Whitmore, the town doctor, began to notice the strange reports from the orphanage. His medical background had made him naturally observant, and he started keeping detailed notes about the inconsistencies in the stories told by the delivery boys and the few other townspeople who had reason to visit the building. What concerned him most was the total lack of any requests for medical help. In his 30 years of practice, Dr. Whitmore had never met a group of children that didn't need at least some medical care. When he offered his services for free to the orphanage, Father Kellerman declined politely but firmly, explaining that the children were blessed with excellent health, and Sister Margaret Clare had all the medical knowledge needed for their care. This explanation might have satisfied the townspeople, but Dr. Whitmore knew enough about medicine to understand that no group of children, especially orphans who had likely suffered from malnutrition and exposure before arriving, could maintain perfect health without professional medical care. He began to suspect that either the children were not actually healthy or they were not actually there. The first real evidence that something was seriously wrong came in the spring of 1835, when a traveling merchant named Jacob Reinhardt arrived in Millbrook with a disturbing story. Reinhardt claimed that, while passing through a town 50 miles east, he had met a young girl, begging on the streets, who told him she had escaped from the place with the bell that never stops ringing. The girl, who looked about 10 years old, had fresh scars on her arms and spoke in terrified whispers about the sister who makes the children disappear. When Reinhardt asked the girl to explain, she became hysterical and ran away, but not before mentioning the name Santa Eulalia. Reinhardt, who was Catholic himself, was disturbed enough by the encounter to ask questions about the orphanage. When he reached Millbrook, he was told that Santa Eulalia was a model institution doing God's work, but something in the townspeople's responses made him suspect they were trying to convince themselves as much as him. Father Kellerman learned of Reinhardt's questions and visited the merchant at his inn that evening. Their conversation was private, but the innkeeper later reported hearing raised voices and what sounded like threats. The next morning, Reinhardt left town without finishing his business, and he never returned to Millbrook. The incident with the merchant began a pattern that would continue for years. Anyone who asked too many questions about the orphanage would get a visit from Father Kellerman, after which they would either go silent or leave town completely. The priest seemed to have an uncanny ability to know exactly who was talking about the orphanage and what they were saying. But the most disturbing development came later that spring, when the bronze bell in the orphanage tower began ringing at increasingly strange hours. The bell, which had previously rung only for prayers and meals, now tolled at midnight, at 3 a.m., and sometimes continuously for hours during the day. When townspeople complained about the noise, Father Kellerman explained that the bell was being used to mark the sacred hours of prayer and contemplation. Dr. Whitmore, however, recognized the pattern of the bells ringing in his medical studies. He had learned about the psychological effects of sleep deprivation and constant noise on the human mind. The pattern of the bells tolling seemed designed not to call people to prayer, but to prevent anyone from sleeping soundly. He began to wonder if the bell was being used as a form of psychological torture, though he couldn't understand why anyone would want to torture children. The summer of 1835 brought the first disappearance that couldn't be explained away. Anna Dietrich, whose parents had died in a cholera outbreak, had been brought to the orphanage by her aunt in the spring. The aunt, Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, had been promised she could visit her niece once a month to ensure her welfare, but when she arrived for her second visit, she was told that Anna had been placed with a loving family in Baltimore and would not be returning. Mrs. Hoffman demanded to know the identity of this family so she could stay in contact with her niece, but Sister Margaret Clare claimed that the adoptive family had requested complete privacy. When Mrs. Hoffman insisted on seeing documentation of the adoption, she was told that all such records were confidential church property. Suspicious and increasingly desperate, Mrs. Hoffman refused to leave the orphanage without more information about her niece. She began questioning the other children, but they seemed terrified to speak to her. When she pressed them, they would only whisper that Anna had gone to the quiet place, and that they hoped they would never have to go there too. The confrontation escalated when Mrs. Hoffman demanded to search the entire building for her niece. Father Kellerman arrived and, in front of several witnesses, had her physically removed from the property by two men he claimed were protectors of the church. Mrs. Hoffman left Millbrook that day and never returned, but she spent the rest of her life writing letters to church authorities, demanding an investigation into what had happened to her niece. By the end of 1835, the pattern had become clear to anyone willing to see it. Children arrived at Santa Eulalia Orphanage. They were rarely seen or heard from again, and anyone who asked too many questions was either silenced or driven away. The bronze bell continued to toll at all hours. The children who could be glimpsed through the windows grew thinner and paler, and Father Kellerman's sermons became increasingly focused on themes of sacrifice, purification, and the need for absolute obedience to God's will. The townspeople wanted to believe they were witnessing a great work of charity, but deep in their hearts, they were beginning to suspect that something far more sinister was happening behind the walls of Santa Eulalia Orphanage. The question was whether anyone would have the courage to discover the truth before it was too late. For the 93 children who had entered those doors, the winter of 1835 brought changes to Santa Eulalia Orphanage that even the most willfully ignorant townspeople could no longer ignore. The building itself seemed to take on a malevolent presence, its tall windows glowing with candlelight at all hours, while shadows moved behind the glass in patterns that suggested activities far more disturbing than simple prayer or study. Sister Catherine, the youngest of the 3 nuns, had begun to show signs of severe psychological distress. Those who encountered her during her increasingly rare trips to town noticed that she had developed a pronounced tremor in her hands and would flinch violently at sudden noises. Her once bright eyes had taken on a haunted quality, and she had lost so much weight that her habit hung loose on her frame like a burial shroud. Dr. Whitmore, whose medical curiosity had evolved into genuine concern, began documenting these changes in his private journal. He wrote, "Sister Catherine appears to be suffering from what I can only describe as a form of nervous exhaustion, typically seen in soldiers who have witnessed prolonged combat. The question that haunts me is, what war is being fought within the walls of that orphanage?" The answer came in fragments, whispered confessions from Sister Catherine during her few interactions with townspeople. To Mrs. Mary Patterson, the baker's wife, she muttered, "The children, they try to be so good, but it's never enough. It's never enough for her." When Mrs. Patterson asked what she meant, Sister Catherine's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "Sister Margaret Clare says that suffering purifies the soul, but I fear we are not purifying anything. We are destroying it." These cryptic statements began to paint a picture of systematic abuse being carried out under the guise of religious discipline. Father Kellerman had developed what he called the sacred method, a program of spiritual purification that he claimed was based on ancient Catholic practices, but was actually his own twisted interpretation of medieval monastic discipline combined with his growing obsession with the concept of child martyrdom. The sacred method involved what Father Kellerman described as graduated trials of faith, designed to strip away the children's worldly attachments and prepare their souls for direct communion with God. These trials began with extreme fasting, moved through various forms of physical penance, and culminated in what he called the final purification, a process that Sister Catherine's fragmented confession suggested was far more sinister than mere prayer. The bronze bell played a central role in this system of control. Its constant tolling was not just a call to prayer, but a psychological conditioning tool that trained the children to respond immediately to any sound with absolute obedience. The irregular timing of the bell, sometimes silent for hours, sometimes ringing continuously, created a state of constant anxiety that made the children desperate to please their caretakers in hopes of earning moments of peace. Local merchant Samuel Crane, who had been delivering food supplies to the orphanage for over a year, began to notice disturbing patterns in the types and quantities of food being ordered. The amount seemed far too small to feed the number of children that the orphanage supposedly housed, and the types of food suggested a diet so restrictive that it bordered on deliberate starvation. When he questioned Sister Bernadette about this, she explained that the children are learning to find nourishment in prayer rather than earthly sustenance. More troubling still were the special orders that began arriving from Philadelphia medical supplies that seemed more suited to a hospital than an orphanage. These included large quantities of laudanum, surgical instruments, and chemicals that Dr. Whitmore recognized as embalming fluids. When he inquired about these supplies, he was told that Sister Margaret Clare was conducting advanced medical research that had been approved by the church. The truth about Sister Margaret Clare's background began to emerge through correspondence with other religious institutions. She had not, as she claimed, trained with the Sisters of Mercy in Ireland. Instead, she had been expelled from a convent in France for what church records described as theological irregularities and dangerous innovations in the treatment of children. She had arrived in America under an assumed name and had somehow convinced Father Kellerman that she was a qualified educator and medical practitioner. In reality, Sister Margaret Clare had developed her own heretical interpretation of Catholic doctrine that combined elements of extreme asceticism with what could only be described as a form of religious sadism. She believed that children, being naturally innocent, had the greatest capacity for spiritual purification through suffering, and that by subjecting them to increasingly severe trials, she could transform them into perfect vessels for God's grace. The children who survived these trials were, according to her twisted theology, blessed with a spiritual purity that elevated them above ordinary human existence. Those who did not survive were considered to have achieved the ultimate purification martyrdom and were allegedly given special burials in what she called the sacred ground beneath the orphanage. Timothy Fletcher, the delivery boy who had witnessed the strange ceremony in the chapel, began to experience dreams that seemed more like memories than imagination. In these dreams, he saw children kneeling in perfect silence, while Sister Margaret Clare performed rituals that involved marking their bodies with religious symbols and forcing them to consume substances that made them violently ill. He dreamed of a hidden room beneath the chapel, where small wooden crosses were carved with names and dates, and where the smell of earth mixed with something sweet and terrible. These dreams became so vivid and disturbing that Timothy began to question whether he had actually seen more than he remembered during his brief visit to the orphanage. He started to wonder if his mind had protected him from the full horror of what he had witnessed by blocking out the most traumatic memories. The first concrete evidence of the orphanage's true nature came in the spring of 1836 when a construction worker named Patrick O'Brien was hired to repair the roof of the bell tower. O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had worked on many church buildings, was skilled at moving quietly through religious spaces without disrupting the occupants. His job required him to access the tower through a narrow staircase that ran along the interior wall of the building, giving him an unexpected view into several rooms that were normally hidden from public view. What O'Brien saw during his week of work on the tower changed his life forever. Through the windows of what appeared to be a dormitory, he witnessed Sister Margaret Clare conducting what she called morning purification, a ritual that involved forcing the children to kneel naked on the cold wooden floor while she examined their bodies for signs of spiritual impurity. Those who showed any sign of illness, injury, or even normal childhood curiosity were marked with ash on their foreheads and led away to a room that O'Brien never saw them leave. More disturbing still was what O'Brien observed in the basement of the building, which Sister Margaret Clare had claimed didn't exist. Through a small window at ground level, he could see a room that appeared to be set up as a primitive medical facility, complete with a wooden table, surgical instruments, and jars containing what looked like human organs preserved in fluid. The walls were covered with detailed anatomical drawings that seemed to focus on the internal structure of children's bodies. O'Brien was a devout Catholic who had immigrated to America to escape religious persecution. But what he saw at Santa Eulalia Orphanage shook his faith to its core. He struggled with the question of whether he should report what he had seen to the authorities, knowing that doing so might bring persecution upon the entire Catholic community in Millbrook. His decision was made for him when he witnessed what he later described as the most terrible thing a human being can see. On his final day of work, while adjusting the bell mechanism in the tower, he heard singing coming from the basement. Following the sound, he discovered a hidden entrance to the underground room and found Sister Margaret Clare conducting what she called the final purification on a young boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The boy was lying on the wooden table, his small body marked with religious symbols that had been cut into his skin with surgical precision. He was conscious but appeared to be in a state of extreme euphoria, most likely from the laudanum that Sister Margaret Clare was administering to him through a cloth held over his nose. She was singing a Latin hymn while using her surgical instruments to remove what she described as the physical barriers to spiritual transcendence. O'Brien realized with growing horror that he was witnessing not a medical procedure, but a ritualistic murder being carried out in the name of religious purification. The boy's body showed signs of other injuries that had been inflicted over time from previous purifications that had been designed to gradually break down his physical form until his soul could be released to join God in paradise. Unable to watch any longer, O'Brien burst into the room and confronted Sister Margaret Clare. She showed no shame or surprise at being discovered, but instead invited him to witness what she called the moment of greatest spiritual beauty, the child's death. She explained that the boy had been chosen for this honor because he had achieved a level of spiritual purity that made him worthy of martyrdom. O'Brien grabbed the child from the table and ran from the building, but it was too late. The boy died in his arms before he could reach Dr. Whitmore's office, his last words being a whispered prayer in Latin that Sister Margaret Clare had taught him to recite during his final moments. The death of this unnamed child marked the beginning of the end for Santa Eulalia Orphanage, but it would take another 15 years before the full scope of the horror would be revealed. O'Brien's testimony would eventually lead to an investigation that would uncover the truth about what had happened to the 93 children who had entered those doors. But first, he would have to survive the consequences of challenging an institution that had grown powerful enough to silence anyone who threatened its dark work. Patrick. O'Brien's confrontation with Sister Margaret Clare set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the truth about Santa Eulalia Orphanage, but not before the institution and its supporters fought desperately to maintain their deadly secret. The construction worker's decision to save the dying child had been brave, but it had also made him a target for forces more powerful and ruthless than he had imagined. Within hours of O'Brien's escape from the orphanage, Father Kellerman arrived at the construction site where the Irishman was supposed to be working. When told that O'Brien had left suddenly without completing his contract, the priest's reaction was swift and decisive. He claimed that O'Brien had stolen valuable church property and convinced the local sheriff to issue a warrant for his arrest. But O'Brien had anticipated this response. Instead of fleeing Millbrook, he had gone directly to Dr. Whitmore's office with the dying child, knowing that the physician's medical expertise would be crucial in documenting what had been done to the boy. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed evidence of systematic torture that had been carried out over a period of weeks, possibly months. The child's body showed signs of deliberate starvation, ritualistic cutting, and the administration of drugs that had been designed to induce religious visions and compliance. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Whitmore discovered that the boy's internal organs had been systematically damaged in ways that suggested someone with medical knowledge had been conducting experiments on his living body. The pattern of injuries was consistent with what Dr. Whitmore had read about in medieval accounts of religious extremists who believed that physical suffering could accelerate spiritual purification. Dr. Whitmore immediately documented his findings and sent copies of his report to medical colleagues in Philadelphia and New York, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if he were silenced. He also provided O'Brien with a detailed medical report that could be used to support any legal proceedings against the orphanage. However, the reach of Santa Eulalia Orphanage's influence extended far beyond Millbrook. Within days of Dr. Whitmore's report being sent, he received visits from representatives of the Diocese of Philadelphia who claimed that O'Brien was a known criminal and that his accusations against the orphanage were part of a conspiracy to discredit the Catholic Church. They brought with them what appeared to be official documentation showing that O'Brien had been convicted of theft and fraud in Ireland before immigrating to America. The documents were forgeries, but they were sophisticated enough to convince local authorities who were already uncomfortable with the idea of investigating a religious institution. The sheriff, who had been under pressure from prominent Catholic families to arrest O'Brien, used the forged documents as justification to issue a warrant for the construction worker's arrest on charges of theft, fraud, and making false accusations against a religious institution. O'Brien was forced to flee Millbrook, but not before he had shared his story with several trusted individuals, including Timothy Fletcher, who had finally found the courage to speak about what he had witnessed in the orphanage chapel. The two men's testimonies corroborated each other in ways that made it impossible to dismiss their accounts as mere fantasy or malicious lies. Timothy's mother, Mrs. Fletcher, had initially been reluctant to believe her son's story, but O'Brien's detailed account of what he had seen convinced her that Timothy had been telling the truth all along. She began to understand that her son's nightmares and behavioral changes had been caused by witnessing genuine horror, not by an overactive imagination. Mrs. Fletcher made a decision that would prove crucial to the eventual exposure of the orphanage's crimes. She began secretly documenting everything she could learn about the institution, keeping detailed records of the children who had been brought there, the inconsistencies in the stories told by the nuns, and the strange occurrences that townspeople had reported over the years. Her investigation revealed patterns that were even more disturbing than O'Brien's eyewitness account had suggested. The number of children who had allegedly been placed with loving families was far higher than could be explained by normal adoption rates, and none of these families could be located or verified. The orphanage's financial records, which she obtained through her husband's connections with local merchants, showed payments for supplies that suggested the institution was housing far fewer children than it claimed. Most significant of all, Mrs. Fletcher discovered that Sister Margaret Clare had been corresponding with individuals in Europe who shared her twisted theological views. These letters, which she obtained through a contact in the postal service, revealed that the orphanage was part of a network of religious extremists who believed that child martyrdom was the highest form of spiritual achievement. The letters described, in disturbing detail, the methods that Sister Margaret Clare had developed for what she called the systematic purification of innocent souls. These methods were based on her belief that children who died in a state of artificially induced spiritual ecstasy would immediately ascend to heaven and become powerful intercessors for the souls of the living. According to her correspondence, Sister Margaret Clare had successfully purified 37 children during her first 2 years at the orphanage, and she was planning to expand her operations to include children from other institutions. She wrote about her experiments with different combinations of drugs, surgical procedures, and psychological techniques that could induce the religious visions and compliance necessary for what she called voluntary martyrdom. The letters, also, revealed that Father Kellerman was not just complicit in these activities but was actually the intellectual architect of the entire system. His theological training had led him to develop a complex justification for child murder that was based on a twisted interpretation of Catholic doctrine about the nature of innocence and salvation. Father Kellerman believed that children who died before they could be corrupted by the world would automatically enter heaven. But he had taken this belief to its logical extreme by arguing that deliberately killing innocent children was actually the highest form of charity possible. He saw himself as a modern-day Abraham called by God to sacrifice children for the greater good of humanity. The correspondence also revealed that the orphanage had been receiving financial support from wealthy Catholics who believed they were funding a legitimate, charitable institution. These benefactors had no idea that their donations were being used to purchase the drugs, surgical instruments, and other materials necessary for the systematic murder of children. As Mrs. Fletcher's investigation progressed, she began to understand the full scope of the horror that had been taking place at Santa Eulalia Orphanage. The institution had not been saving children. It had been systematically murdering them under the guise of religious purification. The 93 children who had entered those doors had not been adopted by loving families or sent to other institutions. They had been killed in ritualistic ceremonies that Sister Margaret Clare and Father Kellerman believed would guarantee their immediate ascension to heaven. But Mrs. Fletcher's investigation also revealed something even more disturbing: the network of supporters who had made these crimes possible. The orphanage had not operated in isolation, but as part of a broader conspiracy that included wealthy donors, corrupt church officials, and even some government authorities who had been bribed or threatened into silence. The evidence that Mrs. Fletcher had assembled was compelling, but she knew that presenting it to local authorities would be futile. The same forces that had driven O'Brien from town and discredited Dr. Whitmore's medical findings would simply destroy her evidence and silence her testimony. She needed to find a way to expose the truth that would be impossible to suppress or discredit. Her opportunity came in the winter of 1837, when a journalist named Edward Harrington arrived in Millbrook to investigate rumors about unusual activities at the orphanage. Harrington worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer and had built a reputation as a fearless investigator of corruption and abuse within religious institutions. He had heard whispers about Santa Eulalia from several sources, including Dr. Whitmore, who had managed to get word to him despite the efforts to silence his testimony. Harrington's investigation methods were more sophisticated than anything the orphanage's supporters had encountered before. Instead of confronting Father Kellerman directly or trying to gain access to the building, he began documenting the inconsistencies in the orphanage's public records and tracing the backgrounds of the key personnel. His research revealed that Father Kellerman had been expelled from his previous parish in Bavaria for what church records described as theological extremism and dangerous innovations in pastoral care. The priest had arrived in America under circumstances that suggested he had been fleeing some form of scandal or legal trouble in Europe. More significantly, Harrington discovered that Sister Margaret Clare was not actually a nun at all, but a former medical student who had been dismissed from university in Paris for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers. She had assumed the identity of a deceased Irish nun and had used forged credentials to gain admission to various religious institutions across Europe before ultimately making her way to America. The journalist's investigation also uncovered financial irregularities that suggested the orphanage was being used as a front for a much larger criminal operation. Large sums of money were being funneled through the institution from sources that could not be traced, and these funds were being used to purchase supplies and services that had nothing to do with caring for children. As Harrington's investigation progressed, he began to receive threats from anonymous sources warning him to abandon his research. These threats escalated from simple warnings to physical violence when unknown assailants attacked him outside his hotel room one night, beating him severely and warning him that he would be killed if he continued his investigation. But Harrington was not easily intimidated, and the attack only convinced him that he was on the right track. He began working with Mrs. Fletcher to compile a comprehensive dossier that would expose not just the crimes being committed at the orphanage, but the entire network of corruption that had made those crimes possible. Their collaboration produced a document that was devastating in its scope and detail. It included copies of the correspondence between Sister Margaret Clare and her European contacts, financial records showing the flow of money through the orphanage, medical evidence from Dr. Whitmore's examination of the murdered child, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed suspicious activities at the institution. Most damaging of all, the dossier included a detailed timeline that showed how the orphanage's operators had systematically eliminated anyone who had tried to expose their crimes. The document revealed that several individuals who had asked questions about the orphanage had died under mysterious circumstances, including Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, who had been found dead in a Baltimore hotel room just weeks after demanding information about her missing niece. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who can handle the darkest truths about America's hidden history. Just when we thought we'd uncovered the worst of what happened at